Compliance. You need a favor from a friend. How should you ask? You're trying to raise funds for a favorite charity. How should you go about getting people to donate their hard-earned money? Your first job out of college is in sales. How do you get people to sign on the dotted line? These are all questions about compliance, getting people to comply with something you want. Coming from the other direction, how can you avoid being influenced by the compliance attempts of others? What techniques should you watch out for? Social psychologists have studied different strategies for eliciting compliance, and their research findings help explain how, and how effectively, these strategies work. There are 3 basic types of compliance approaches: those directed at the head, those directed at the heart, and those based on the power of norms, which, given the impact of informational and normative influences, appeal to both the head and the heart. People can be led to comply with requests because they see good reasons for doing so, because their emotions compel them to do so, or because everyone else is doing so. Of course, these types of influence aren't always neatly separable, and many compliance efforts are a blend of the 3. Reason-based approaches. We often make decisions by weighing the pros and cons, by tabulating the reasons for and against different options, and choosing the one with the most favorable balance of good and bad. Some attempts to influence other people are targeted at changing their decision calculus. Reason-based approaches aim to convince people that they would be better off choosing a particular course of action. Norm of reciprocity. When someone does something for us, we usually feel compelled to do something in return. Indeed, all societies that have ever been studied possess a powerful norm of reciprocity, according to which people are expected to provide benefits for those who provided benefits for them. This norm also exists in many bird and mammal species. When one monkey removes parasites from another's back, the latter typically returns the favor, thus helping cement the social bond between them. Norm of reciprocity. A norm dictating that people should provide benefits to those who benefit them. When someone does you a favor, you have a tacit obligation to agree to any reasonable request that person might make in return. To fail to respond is to violate a powerful social norm and run the risk of social condemnation. Indeed, the English language is rich in derogatory terms for those who don't uphold their end of the bargain: sponge, moocher, bum, deadbeat, ingrate, parasite, bloodsucker, leech. If you do a favor for someone, that person will probably agree to a reasonable request you subsequently make to avoid being seen as a moocher. This may be why restaurant customers often leave larger tips when the server gives them a piece of candy. All contacts among men rest on the schema of giving and returning the equivalent. George Simmel, German sociologist. There is no duty more indispensable than that of returning a kindness. Cicero. The influence of the norm of reciprocity in getting someone to comply was demonstrated in a simple experiment in which 2 people were asked to rate a number of paintings, supposedly as part of a study of aesthetics. One was a real participant, the other was a confederate of the experimenter. In one condition, the confederate returned from a break with 2 sodas and offered one to the participant. I asked the experimenter if I could get myself a Coke, and he said it was okay, so I bought one for you too. In another condition, the confederate returned empty-handed. Later, the confederate asked the participant for a favor. He explained that he was selling raffle tickets. The prize was a new car, and he'd win $50 if he sold the most tickets. He then proceeded to ask if the participant was willing to buy any tickets for 25 cents apiece. Any would help, the more the better. To make sure all participants had the means to purchase some tickets, they had already been paid in quarters for participating in the study. In a testament to the power of the norm of reciprocity, participants who earlier had been given a soda by the confederate bought twice as many raffle tickets as those who had not, or those who had been given a soda by the experimenter, to control for the possibility that simply receiving a soda, and perhaps being in a good mood as a result, is what had increased compliance. Reciprocity and grooming among mammals. Reciprocity helps promote group living and reduce aggression, as evidenced by grooming in macaques. They abide by the rule, You scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. Macaque A is more likely to groom macaque B than a random other macaque if macaque B has previously groomed macaque A. Thus, doing a favor for someone creates an uninvited debt that the recipient is obligated to repay. Businesses and other organizations often try to take advantage of this pressure by preceding their request with a small gift. Insurance agents give out calendars or return address labels. Marketers who want us to complete a survey send it along with $1. Cult members offer a flower before giving their pitch. Sometimes our hearts can sink when we see these gifts coming, and we often go to great lengths to avoid them, recognizing the obligations they bring. The reciprocal concessions, door-in-the-face technique. Robert Cialdini, social psychologist, most innovative contributor to the literature on compliance, has explored a novel application of the norm of reciprocity. The inspiration for his research on the subject is best introduced in his own words. I was walking down the street when I was approached by an 11 or 12-year-old boy. He introduced himself and said that he was selling tickets to the annual Boy Scout circus to be held on the upcoming Saturday night. He asked if I wished to buy any at $5 apiece. Since one of the last places I wanted to spend Saturday evening was with the Boy Scouts, I declined. Well, he said, if you don't want to buy any tickets, how about buying some of our big chocolate bars? They're only $1 each. I bought a couple and, right away, realized that something noteworthy had happened. I knew that to be the case because A, I do not like chocolate bars, B, I do like dollars, C, I was standing there with 2 of his chocolate bars, and D, he was walking away with 2 of my dollars. 1984. Cialdini's experience with the Boy Scout led him to articulate a general compliance technique whereby people feel compelled to respond to a concession by making a concession themselves. First, you ask someone for a very large favor that will certainly be refused, and then you follow that request with one for a more modest favor that you are really interested in receiving. The idea is that the drop in the size of the request will be seen as a concession. The person being asked will feel compelled to match that concession to honor the norm of reciprocity. The most available concession the person can make is to comply with the asker's second request. Another way of looking at this reciprocal concessions technique is that the first favor is so large and unreasonable that the target inevitably refuses, slamming the door in the face of that request, but keeping it open just a crack for the subsequent, smaller request to get through. Accordingly, it's also known as the door in the face technique. Reciprocal concessions technique, a compliance approach that involves asking someone for a very large favor that will certainly be refused, and then following that request with one for a smaller favor, which tends to be seen as a concession the target feels compelled to honor. Cialdini demonstrated the power of this technique in a field study in which members of his research team posed as representatives of the county youth counseling program and approached students around campus. They asked individual students if they would be willing to chaperone a group of juvenile delinquents on a trip to the zoo. Not surprisingly, the overwhelming majority, 83%, refused, but the response rate was much different for a second group of students who had first encountered a much larger request. They were first asked whether they would be willing to counsel juvenile delinquents for 2 hours a week for the next 2 years. Not surprisingly, all of them refused, at which point they were asked about chaperoning the trip to the zoo. 50% of these students agreed to chaperone, triple the rate of the other group. A series of carefully crafted follow-up studies revealed that the pressure participants felt to comply to what was perceived as a concession, chaperone one trip to the zoo, rather than provide counsel for the next 2 years, was responsible for the dramatic increase in compliance. Accordingly, this technique doesn't work when the 2 requests are made by different individuals. In that case, the second, smaller request isn't seen as a concession, but rather an entirely separate request by a different person, so the person being asked doesn't feel the same obligation. The foot in the door technique. All of us perform certain actions because they're consistent with our self-image. Environmentalists take the time to recycle, even when sorely tempted to toss a bottle or can into the trash, because that's part of what it means to be an environmentalist. Skiers rise early to tackle fresh snow, even when they really want to hit the snooze button on the alarm clock, because that's what real skiing enthusiasts do. It's logical, therefore, that if requests are crafted to appeal to a person's self-image, the likelihood of compliance is increased. One way to appeal to a person's self-image is to employ what's known as the foot in the door technique. It starts with a small request to which nearly everyone complies, thereby allowing the person making the request to get a foot in the door. This person then follows up with a larger request involving the real behavior of interest. The idea is that the initial agreement to the small request will lead to a change in the target person's self-image as someone who does this sort of thing or who contributes to such causes. That person then has a reason for agreeing to the subsequent larger request. It's just who I am. In an early test of this technique, the investigators knocked on doors in a residential neighborhood and asked one group of homeowners if they would be willing to have a large billboard sign bearing the slogan "Drive Carefully" installed in their front yard for 1 week, 1966. They were shown a picture of the sign. It was large and unattractive, so not surprisingly, only 17% agreed to the request. Another group of residents was approached with a much smaller request to display in a window of their home a 3-inch square sign bearing the phrase, "Be a safe driver." Virtually all of them agreed with the request. 2 weeks later, when this group was asked to display the billboard in their yard, receiving the very same request as those in the first group, a staggering 76% of them agreed to do so. Foot in the door technique, a compliance approach that involves making an initial small request with which nearly everyone complies, followed by a larger request involving the real behavior of interest. You've probably heard politicians oppose a piece of legislation, not because there's anything wrong with the legislation itself, but because they think it might create a slippery slope, leading to the passage of more questionable legislation. Later on, research on the foot in the door technique suggests that there is merit to this concern. Human behavior, like a ball rolling down a sloping plane, is subject to momentum. Getting people started on something small often makes it easier to get them to do much bigger things down the road. We'll see just how powerful these slippery slopes can be when we discuss the most famous studies in all of social psychology later in this chapter. The foot in the door technique. After getting the customer to agree to a test drive, it may be easier for the salesperson to close the deal and have her buy the car. Emotion-based approaches. Cognitive or reason-based approaches aim at the head and, as we have seen, can be very effective in obtaining compliance. Affective or emotion-based approaches aim at the heart, and they too are powerful tools for eliciting compliance. Positive mood. Suppose you want to ask your dad for a new computer, a new amplifier for your guitar, or simply to borrow the family car for a road trip. When would you ask? When he's just come home from work in a foul mood, cursing his boss and his suffocating job? Or after he's just landed a promotion and a big raise? It doesn't take an advanced degree in psychology to know that it's better to request a favor when the person's in a good mood. A positive mood makes people feel expansive and charitable, so they're more likely to agree to reasonable requests. Even little children know to wait before asking someone for a favor until that person seems cheerful. The wisdom of this approach has been verified in countless experiments. In one study, participants received a telephone call from someone who claimed to have spent her last dime on this very misdialed call. She asked if they would call a specified number and relay a message, 1976. In one condition, shortly before receiving the call, participants were given a free sample of stationery to put them in a positive mood. In another condition, participants did not receive a free sample before the call. When the request was made of those without the free sample, only 10% complied, but the compliance rate shot up dramatically among participants who received the request a few minutes after receiving the gift. The compliance rate then declined gradually as the delay between receiving the gift and hearing the request increased, figure 9.7. Positive mood and requests. When people are in a good mood, they are more likely to agree to requests. Those attending this benefit for the charitable organization, Pencils of Promise, and getting to shake Usher's hand are therefore more likely to donate money to support the charity's effort to build schools and expand educational opportunities around the globe. A positive mood tends to increase compliance for two main reasons. First, our mood colors how we interpret events. We're more likely to view requests for favors as less intrusive and less threatening when we're in a good mood. We're more inclined to give others the benefit of the doubt. For instance, when you're in a good mood, you're more likely to consider someone who asks to borrow your class notes to be a victim of circumstance who could get back on track with a little help, rather than an irresponsible or lazy person who doesn't deserve to be bailed out. The second reason a positive mood tends to increase compliance involves what's known as mood maintenance. Pardon the tautology, but it feels good to feel good, and we typically want that feeling to last as long as possible. One way to sustain a good mood is to do something for another person. Stated differently, one way to wreck a good mood is to turn down a request for a favor and invite all sorts of self-recrimination. What kind of heartless person am I? Several studies have shown that wanting to maintain a good mood is an important component of the impact of a positive mood on compliance. In one experiment, some of the participants were first given cookies, which put them in a good mood. The others weren't given cookies. All of them were then asked by someone other than the person who provided the cookies if they'd be willing to assist with an experiment by serving as a confederate. Half the participants were told the job of confederate would involve helping the true participant in the experiment, and the other half were told it would involve hindering the participant. Having received a cookie and being in a good mood increased the compliance rate when the task involved helping the participant, but not when it involved hindering the participant. Helping another person promotes feeling good, hurting someone doesn't. Thus, while being in a good mood increases compliance, it does not do so when the act of compliance would undermine that good mood. Figure 9.7, Positive Mood and Compliance. In this study, being in a good mood bolstered participant compliance, with the effect slowly wearing off with the passage of time. Okay, so you can see on the x-axis, time between gift and request in minutes. It's between 1 to 20 minutes, and on the y-axis is the percentage complying from 0% to 100%. So when there's only 1 minute between the gift and the request, it's about 80% compliance. If it's 4 minutes between, it's 100% compliance. Then it starts going downhill. 7 minutes, it's 80% compliance about again. By 10 minutes, it's only 50% compliance. And by 20 minutes, it's only about 10% compliance. Participants were more likely to comply with the request after receiving a gift. This effect diminished with time as their good mood presumably wore off. Negative mood. If a good mood increases compliance, does a bad mood decrease it? It surely can. Your dad is less likely to lend you the family car when he's mad at his boss, but even the slightest introspection reveals that certain types of bad moods are actually likely to increase compliance, not decrease it. Some people know this and use it to their advantage. Suppose, for example, your girlfriend was flirting with a classmate of yours and you point out the offense. Would that be a good time to ask her for something? You bet it would. When people feel guilty, they're often motivated to do whatever they can to get rid of that awful feeling. And as we have seen, doing something for another makes us feel good and elevates our mood. So at least one type of bad mood, centered around guilt, should increase compliance. Social psychologists have demonstrated a strong positive association between guilt and compliance in many experiments. Participants have been led to feel guilty by being induced to lie, tricked into thinking they've broken a camera, or maneuvered into knocking over stacks of carefully arranged index cards. In a particularly clever study, researchers asked Catholics to donate to a charity when they were either on their way into church for a confession or on their way out. 1975, the presumption was that those on their way in were rehearsing their sins and thus feeling guilty. Those on their way out had done penance for their sins and were no longer plagued by guilt. As predicted, those solicited on the way into church gave more money than those solicited on the way out. Other types of bad moods, not just those produced by guilt, can also increase compliance. In one study, watching an adorable lab rat get accidentally jolted with an intense shock led participants to donate more money to charity than those who hadn't seen the unfortunate event. 1971, and in general it seems that bad moods sometimes increase compliance in part because we simply don't want to feel bad, and helping others makes us feel better, so we jump at the chance to brighten our mood. This is the negative state relief hypothesis in action, which says that taking an action to benefit someone else, especially when it's for a good cause, is one way to make ourselves feel better. We often help others, in other words, to help ourselves. A final word about the impact of moods, good and bad, on compliance. Investigators in Israel have found that if parole judges had just finished a meal before hearing a prisoner's plea for release from prison, there was a 2/3 chance they would vote for parole. Cases that came up just before lunch, however, when the judges were hungry and presumably crankier, had precisely a 0 chance for parole. A full stomach makes a difference, so hit your dad up for the car keys after dinner, not before. Negative state relief. Oskar Schindler, in the center, saved the lives of 1,200 Polish Jews during the Holocaust. Initially driven by the desire for easy profits, he took over a Jewish factory and ran it with cheap Jewish labor. Perhaps in a desire for negative state relief or from sheer humanitarianism, he used the millions he made from the cheap labor to bribe officials to save those who were slated for death. He is pictured here in Tel Aviv with some of those he saved and their descendants. Negative state relief hypothesis. The idea that people engage in certain actions, such as agreeing to a request, to relieve their negative feelings and feel better about themselves. Norm-based approaches. Adolescent girls exposed to pregnant peers are more likely to become pregnant themselves. Planning for retirement is greatly influenced by coworkers' plans, and student drinking is connected to student perceptions of how much other students drink. The tendency to conform to people around us can be harnessed to achieve compliance with explicit requests or implicit suggestions. The best way to get people to do something is to tell them that their neighbors are already doing it. Joshua Green, psychologist. Norm-based approaches to compliance are based on the power of social norms. They appeal to both the head and the heart. Effective norm-based appeals, letting people know what others are doing, can be used to advance the public good. Consider a norm-based approach to energy use that was instituted in California, 2007. Researchers left hang tags on people's doors indicating their average daily residential energy use in kilowatt hours, as well as that of their neighbors. The effect of this simple intervention was clear-cut and immediate. Those who consumed more energy than average altered their habits to significantly reduce their energy use. What about the households that used less energy than average? Did telling them that their neighbors tended to be less conscientious make them more wasteful? Yes, it did. But the investigators had a simple remedy at hand that preserved the decrease in energy use among the energy wasters while avoiding increased energy use by the energy savers. The usage information given to half the households was accompanied by a small sign of approval or disapproval, a happy face for those who had used relatively little energy, and a sad face for those who had used more than average. The signal of approval to the former was enough to maintain the superior conservation efforts of those who might otherwise have slacked off after hearing that their neighbors used more energy than they did. Figure 9.8, used wisely. Providing information about norms can be a powerful tool to promote energy conservation. Giving consumers information about norms reduces energy consumption by the same amount as does raising the price of energy 10 to 20%. Telling people about social norms is likely to be most effective when the information is surprising, when people have misunderstood the norm, such as when people overestimate the popularity of destructive behavior or underestimate the popularity of constructive behavior. Student drinking is a case in point. On campuses around the United States, students think that binge drinking is much more common than it actually is, and that teetotaling or moderate drinking is much less common than it is. 2005. These beliefs represent examples of pluralistic ignorance discussed in Chapter 4. In one study, Deborah Prentice and Dale Miller, 1993, examined the discrepancy between private attitudes and public norms about alcohol use at Princeton University. Prentice and Miller asked Princeton undergraduates how comfortable they felt about campus drinking habits. as well as the comfort level of both their friends and the average undergraduate. If the student was suffering from pluralistic ignorance, they would indicate that they were less at ease with drinking than they supposed most students were. The results, shown in figure 9.9, indicate that this is exactly what happened. Hidden discomfort with alcohol existed side by side with perceived popular support. Figure 9.9, pluralistic ignorance. A. University students believe drinking alcohol is more popular among their peers than it really is. Because of this belief, they censor their own reservations about drinking, thus furthering the illusion that alcohol is so popular. B. These results show student ratings of their own and others' comfort with campus drinking habits at Princeton University, 1993. Okay, so it's 3 bars of a bar graph. The x-axis is self, friends, and average student. The y-axis is comfort with alcohol from 0 to 8. You can see that self is least comfortable, friends are more comfortable, and they assume the average student is the most comfortable. Students perceived other students to be more comfortable with drinking than they themselves were. Prentice and Miller attributed the discrepancy to the visibility of drinking on campus. The alcohol situation at Princeton is exacerbated by the central role of alcohol in many of the university's institutions and traditions. For example, at the eating clubs, the center of social life on campus, alcohol is on tap 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Princeton reunions boast the second highest level of alcohol consumption for any event in the country, after the Indianapolis 500. The social norms for drinking at the university are clear. Students must be comfortable with alcohol use to partake of Princeton social life. Figure 9.8, using norms to conserve energy. In this study, telling above-average energy consumers how much energy they use and how much the average household uses significantly reduced energy consumption, bars on the left. Providing this information to below-average energy consumers led to significantly greater energy consumption, unless it was accompanied by a simple symbol of approval, bars on the right. Okay, so on the x-axis, you have 2 paired bar graphs. So you have above average users, and when they have the norm information, they use a lot less. And when they have norm information plus approval or disapproval, like the sad face, they use even less. And then you have below average users, and they start to use more when they have the norm information only, but when they have a happy face for the norm information plus approval, they hardly use more energy at all. Efforts to stem excessive alcohol consumption by providing students with accurate information about their peers' drinking habits has proved to be quite effective. In one study, students attending regularly scheduled club or organizational meetings typed into wireless keypads information about their own drinking behavior and their beliefs about the drinking habits of their peers. 2008, their aggregate responses were immediately projected for all to see, giving everyone information about actual drinking behavior on campus and correcting widespread misunderstandings of how much and how often other students drink. In follow-up online surveys conducted 1 or 2 months later, students who received this information reported drinking significantly less than they had previously and less than students in a control group. Similar norm-based approaches have been used to combat harassment and bullying in schools. In one study, half of a group of 56 middle schools in New Jersey were randomly assigned to a social norm treatment condition, in which a randomly selected group of students was asked to model opposition to the kinds of conflict and harassment that were common at their school. For example, speaking out when one student taunted or viciously teased another. The other schools served as controls. Disciplinary reports declined in the treatment schools by 30% relative to the control schools. As you might expect, some students were more effective than others at modeling anti-harassment norms, with the more popular students having a bigger effect on their peers' beliefs about what sorts of conflicts are common or acceptable at their school. Descriptive and prescriptive norms. In preparing norm-based compliance appeals, it's important to be aware that there are 2 kinds of norms. Descriptive norms are simply descriptions of what is typically done. Prescriptive norms, often called injunctive norms, are what one is supposed to do. Descriptive norms correspond to what is. Prescriptive norms correspond to what ought to be. University administrators often say that students should get 8 to 9 hours of sleep each night. Prescriptive norm. But most students sleep much less. Descriptive norm. To increase compliance, the two norms should not be placed in conflict with each other. A common mistake is to try to strengthen the pull of the prescriptive norm by stating how infrequently it is followed. Isn't it a shame that so few people vote in elections, eat a healthy diet, get screened for cancer, you name it? Making such an appeal seems sensible, but note that it highlights the unfortunate reality, the descriptive norm, as much or more than the prescriptive norm you want to promote. By saying what a shame it is that so few people vote, you're pointing out that few people vote. Given the power of descriptive norms, such information can actually make people less likely to vote, not more likely. Indeed, those involved in Get Out to Vote campaigns now realize, thanks to research by social psychologists, that it's more effective to emphasize how many people vote, not how few. Descriptive norm, the behavior exhibited by most people in a given context. Prescriptive norm, the way a person is supposed to behave in a given context, also called injunctive norm. Descriptive and prescriptive norms in conflict. By telling people they shouldn't remove petrified wood from the Petrified National Forest, prescriptive norm, park officials are communicating that stealing wood is something people do. Descriptive norm, this can increase the very action, theft, the authorities want to prevent. Collecting petrified wood prohibited. Researchers conducted an ingenious investigation of this approach in the Petrified Forest National Park in Arizona, where visitors sometimes take samples of petrified wood home with them as souvenirs. 2006. If everyone took samples, of course, there would soon be no petrified forest to visit. To examine the most effective ways to deal with the problem, the investigators rotated different warning signs at various locations in the park. One sign included the usual emphasis on the severity of the problem, stating, "Many past visitors have removed petrified wood from the park, changing the state of the petrified forest," accompanied by photographs of visitors taking wood. An alternative sign was framed positively. "The vast majority of past visitors have left the petrified wood in the park, preserving the natural state of the petrified forest," with accompanying pictures of visitors admiring and photographing a piece of petrified wood. The investigators placed specially marked pieces of wood along trails near these signs and monitored how many of them were stolen over the course of the experiment. In a remarkable demonstration of the importance of aligning prescriptive and descriptive norms, the theft rate was over 4 times lower when the signs emphasized how few people take wood from the park. Looking back, reason-based approaches induce compliance by providing good reasons for people to agree to a request. The norm of reciprocity compels people to benefit those who have benefited them. In the reciprocal concessions, door-in-the-face technique, people who have refused a large request are then induced to agree to a smaller request. In the foot-in-the-door technique, people comply with a small request and then are induced to grant a larger request. Emotion-based approaches also can lead to compliance. People who are in a positive mood are more likely to comply with a request in order to maintain their good mood. In contrast, according to the negative state relief hypothesis, people who feel guilty or sad are also likely to comply with a request in order to feel better. Norm-based approaches capitalize on people's tendencies to look to others for guidance. People are responsive to both descriptive and prescriptive norms, but it is important that norm-based appeals do not pit the two against each other.